Hello everyone, welcome back to the Politdigm channel. My name is Red, and today we're back with another episode of Politdigm Reads Technofeudalism by Yanis Varoufakis. In today's episode, we are diving into the seventh and last chapter of the book called Escape from Technofeudalism. I would like to say that whilst this book does technically have more content after this chapter, I have made the decision, or we have made the decision, to not read those parts. They're primarily appendixes and just extra information about the book and the terms that Yanis talks about. And since I've been enjoying reading this book so much, I think it's not only right that we, tell you, the viewer, to, if you want to check out that part and want to read the book for yourself, from start to the end, of course, we suggest that you go support Yanis. And also, there's a lot of stuff in the appendix which are just, there's like diagrams and like stuff that I simply cannot show on through just reading. And I think it's much better that you yourself take a look at it. So yeah, today we're reading the last chapter of the book. However, before the episode starts, I just want to remind you that if you enjoy our content and want to support us, you can do so over on Patreon, or if you can support us in a monetary way, you can check out our website to learn how you can support us in alternative matters. If you want to do so, there is a link in the description below. Also, make sure to join our Discord server. Anybody can join. However, if you do join and support us over on Patreon, you get access to some special perks, like being able to submit questions to our weekly Q&A that we host on the Politdigm podcast. And also make sure to support us over at our social media platforms so that you can keep up with the newest news about Politdigm and whatever we are working on. All right, anyways, so in the last episode, we read the chapter about the new Cold War. It was an amazing chapter. Of course, as I always do, I suggest you go watch the last episode to, get context of what we're going to be talking about today. But it was just an amazing chapter, which kind of gave me it just kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things which I hadn't thought about in the vein that Yanis talks about. And it was just amazing, kind of explaining the differences between China and America and how, the new Cold War even came to be, and, kind of the growing influence of the Chinese economy in the world, and the relations between the US and China, and how those used to be okay, but now, they've changed, and there's a whole new sort of bipolar world, just like there was during the Cold War in the last half of the 20th century. And so it's a very interesting chapter. I really enjoyed reading it, and now we're getting into the last chapter. As I said just a few minutes ago, it's called Escape from Technofeudalism, and it's going to be an entire chapter dedicated to Yanis trying to explain how we can get out of this. How can we get out of the new techno-feudal world? At least that's what I'm guessing. And hopefully he presents a sort of, I wouldn't say a solution, but something that we can do to try to overcome this issue, and sort of a updated version or a updated view of the Marxist vision towards, first it was dismantling capitalism, and now we must dismantle techno-feudalism. So I hope that is something that he offers. If not, it is what it is. But it's going to be very interesting. This is also the longest chapter of the book, so it's going to be very in-depth, I am guessing. So with that being said, let's get to reading. It felt like hours before the artist finally appeared. Awaiting him on stage was a shining, oversized, robotic-looking metal exoskeleton suspended by a long cable from the high ceiling of the art space, a converted former power station just outside of Sydney. I was among the audience in the dimly lit turbine room, increasingly captivated by the wafting soundtrack and mesmerized by the elegantly glistening machine. The calendar read 19th of August 2000, a good 4 years before Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook, 6 years before the first tweet, and only a year since the first search on Google. The internet was still in its age of innocence, and the dream of it as an open digital forum for and governed by sovereign participants was still alive. At last, Stellarch the artist emerged. Once inside the exoskeleton, Stellarch would continue to be free to move his legs as he wished, but his arms would be controlled remotely by an anonymous crowd watching and participating via the internet. Stellarch climbed into the machine, which he had named Movtar, and the system began to boot up. Soon enough, it connected to the internet where the visible strangers awaited. Unlike a dancer who captivates you with the effortlessness of their movement, Movatar was compelling for its awkwardness. Its upper body moved jerkily, as if in opposition to the legs beneath. Its clumsy movements were strangely moving, brimming with significance. But signifying what exactly? I sensed a window opening onto the relationship between humans and their technologies, and the same contradictions that had inspired Hesiod. Afterwards, I remember thinking about your question. Was the internet capitalism's friend or foe? Was Movatar part of the answer? And what did it mean for the human condition? Back then, I hadn't a clue. But today, I see it clearly. Stellarch's Movatar prophesied what was to happen to us when traditional capital evolved into cloud capital, from a produced means of production into a produced means of behavior modification. Stellarch was merely experimenting with the idea of the post-human, but his Movatar captured the essence of humanity's future reality. As I see it now, Movatar was a creature of the mercy of hyper-connected, algorithmically driven, cloud-based capital. Another name for it would be Homo Technofeudalism. That's a fancy term. To this day, I envy the way you lived that. You were the epitome of the liberal individual. Sure, to make a living, you had reluctantly to lease yourself to your boss at the steel plant in Eleusis. But during your lunch break, you wandered blissfully in the open-air backyard of the Eleusis Archaeological Museum, where you luxuriated in the discovery of ancient steles, full of clues that antiquities technologists were more advanced than previously thought. And following your return home, at just after 5 every afternoon, and a late siesta, we emerged ready to share in our family life, and on some nights when you weren't messing about with various metals by our fireplace, to write your books and papers. Your life at the factory was, in short, neatly ring-fenced from your personal life. It reflected a time when we thought that, if nothing else, capitalism had granted us sovereignty over ourselves, albeit within certain limited parameters. However, hard one had to work. You could at least fence off a portion of your life, however small, and within that fence remain autonomous, self-determining, free. Leftists like us knew that only the rich were truly free to choose, that the poor were mostly free to lose, and that the worst slavery was that of those who had learned to love their chains. Still, even we, capitalism's harshest critics, appreciated the limited self-ownership it granted us. For young people in today's world, even this small mercy has been taken away. Curating an identity online is not optional, and so their personal lives have become some of the most important work they do. From the moment they take their first steps online, they suffer like Movatar from two perplexing contradictory demands. They are taught implicitly to see themselves as a brand, yet one that will be judged according to its perceived authenticity. And that includes potential employers. No one will offer me a job, a graduate told me once, until I have discovered my true self. And so, before posting any image, uploading any video, reviewing any movie, sharing any photograph or message, they must be mindful of who their choice will please or alienate. They must somehow work out which of their potential true selves will be found most attractive, continually testing their own options against their notion of what the average option among online opinion makers might be. Every experience can be captured and shared, and so they are continuously consumed by the question of whether to do so. And even if no opportunity actually exists for sharing the experience, that opportunity can readily be imagined and will be. Every choice, witnessed or otherwise, becomes an active curation of an identity. One need not be a radical critic of our society to see that the right to a bit of time each day when no one is not for sale has all but vanished. The irony is that the liberal individual has snuffed out neither by fascist brown shirts nor by Stalinist guards. It was killed off when a new form of capital began to instruct youngsters to do that most liberal of things: be yourself and be successful at it. Of all the behavioral modifications that cloud capital has engineered and monetized, this one is surely its overarching and crowning achievement. Possessive individualism has always been detrimental to mental health. Technofeudalism made things infinitely worse when it demolished the fence that used to provide the liberal individual with a refuge from the market. Cloud capital has shattered the individual into fragments of data, an entity comprised of choices as expressed by clicks, which its algorithms are able to manipulate. It has produced individuals who are not so much possessive as possessed, or rather, persons incapable of being self-possessed. It has diminished our capacity to focus by co-opting our attention. We have not become weak-willed. No, our focus has been stolen. And because technofeudalism's algorithms are known to reinforce patriarchy, stereotypes, and pre-existing oppressions, those who are most vulnerable, girls, the mentally ill, the marginalized, and yes, the poor, suffer the outcome most. If fascism taught us anything, it is our susceptibility to demonizing stereotypes and the ugly attraction of emotions like righteousness, fear, envy, and loathing that they arose in us. In our techno-feudal world, the internet brings the feared and the loathed other closer, right in our face. And because online violence seems bloodless and anodyne, we are more likely to respond to this other online with taunting, inhumane language, and bile. Bigotry is technofeudalism's emotional compensation for the frustrations and anxieties we experience in relation to identity and focus. Comment moderators and hate speech regulation can't stop this because it is intrinsic to cloud capital. Those algorithms optimize for cloud rent, which flow more copiously from hatred and discontent. You once told me that finding something timelessly beautiful to focus on, as you did by choosing to lose yourself among the relics of ancient Greece, is our only defense from the demons circling our soul. I have tried to practice this over the years, in my own way. But in the face of techno-feudalism, acting alone, isolated, as liberal individuals, will not get us very far. Cutting ourselves from the internet, switching off our phones, using cash instead of plastic may help us for a while, but they are not solutions. Unless we band together, we shall never civilize or socialize cloud capital, and so we shall never reclaim our own minds from its grip. And herein lies the greatest contradiction. To rescue that foundational liberal idea of liberty as self-ownership will therefore require a comprehensive reconfiguration of property rights over the increasingly cloud-based instruments of production, distribution, collaboration, and communication. To resuscitate the liberal individual, we need to do something that liberals detest: plan a new revolution. Why can't techno-feudalism be tamed by politics in the same way capitalism was restrained, at least for a while, by social democratic governments? Social democrats were able to make a difference during a time when power was vested in old-fashioned industrial capital. They acted as referees between organized labor and the captains of manufacturing industry, metaphorically and occasionally literally, sitting them around a table, forcing them to compromise. The result was, on the one hand, improved wages and conditions for the workers, and on the other hand, the diversion of a chunk of industry profits to pension, hospitals, schools, unemployment insurance, and the arts. But as power shifted from the industry to finance after the death of Bretton Woods in 1971, European Social Democrats and American Democrats alike were lured into a Faustian bargain with the bankers of Wall Street, the City of London, Frankfurt, and Paris. The bargain was crude and simple. Social Democrats in government freed bankers from the shackles of regulation. Go crazy, regulate yourselves, they told them. In return, financiers agreed to hand over the crumbs from their substantial table, in form of a small portion of their gargantuan gains from a rapid financialization to fund the welfare state. In Homeric terms, the Social Democrats had become the era's lotus eaters. As they gorged themselves on financialization, they became intellectually soft and morally complicit in its practices. Its honey-eyed juice lulled them into the belief that what had once been risky was now riskless, that this magic goose would always lay golden eggs, and if those eggs could be used to finance the welfare state, then whatever else the goose did could be justified. And so, when in 2008 the financial capital came crashing down, they lacked both the mental tools and the moral values to tell the bankers, enough. We may save the banks, but not you. Hence the lethal combination of socialism for bankers and austerity for almost everyone else, described in Chapter 4, that stagnated our economies while funding the rise of the cloudalists. In the old days, Social Democrats had a degree of power over the industrialists because they had the backing of the trades unions and could threaten painful regulation. Today, cloudalists do not fear powerful unions because cloud proles are too weak to form them, and cloud serfs do not even consider themselves producers. As for regulation, that has worked by putting a lid on prices or by breaking up cartels. In the age of cloud capital, cloudalists feel safe in the thought that neither makes any sense. Price regulation is irrelevant when the services that consumers need to be protected from are either free or the cheapest on the market already. As for breaking them up, as President Theodore Roosevelt did to Rockefeller when he broke up Standard Oil and other cartels, that was only possible in the old days of terrestrial capital. Standard Oil comprised petrol stations, refineries, and field transport systems strewn all over North America. Breaking it up into regional oil companies and encouraging these to compete with one another was politically hard, but technically dead easy. But how does one break up Amazon, Facebook, PayPal, or indeed Tesla today? Cloudalists know they can destroy any third-party developer, i.e. vassal capitalists, eking out a living on their cloud thief, who dares to contact one of their users, i.e. cloud serfs, without first paying a cloud rent. They know they can treat their users however they like. When did anyone last decline the terms and conditions of a software update? Because of the hostages they are holding are contacts, friends, chat histories, photos, music, videos, all of which we lose if we switch to a competing cloud thief. And they know that there is little that government can do to stop them. Unlike national phone companies, which our national governments force to charge the same rates when calling customers to competing companies, how can they force Twitter to share the backlog of all your tweets, photos, and videos with, say, Mastodon? Even worse, they see that the ideological tide favors them. When you were still a young man, the political left maintained a belief in objective truth and a commitment to constructing new institutions in the service of redistributing incomes, wealth, and power for the higher purpose of improving the human condition. Marxists like yourself went even further, arguing for revolution because they were convinced by the righteousness of their ethical code, the scientific foundation of their social theory, not to mention the belief that they were working towards a desirable end of history, a luxurious liberal communism in which all systematic exploitation and conflict has vanished. Even though the Social Democrats increasingly distanced themselves from and denigrated the Marxist perspective, much of what they accomplished drew strength from those Marxist convictions. The Social Democrat agenda was presented as a way to achieve the same things that Marxists advocated, such as universal healthcare and free education, but without ditching markets, capitalism, and importantly, without the drabness of Soviet communism, the secret police, the Gulag. From today's vantage point, it is fascinating to recall that to counter the left's conviction, it was the political right, back then, which embraced a form of relativism, cautioning against the moral certainties of social democrats, anti-Vietnam War demonstrators, civil rights campaigners, feminists, and arguing that things are more complicated, less black and white, than the unwashed hippies and their older communistic fellows travelers amused. But once the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin in 1991, signaling the defeat of the global left, the tables turned entirely. Suddenly it was the right that embraced unallowed truths and non-negotiable virtues. The same reactionaries who had questioned that all peoples had a universal right to statehood or democracy became converts to their imposition, albeit selectively at gunpoint. The right presented its own new take on the end of history, not socialism, ushering in shared property and radical equality, but a liberal democracy, free markets, and possessive individualism. Meanwhile, the left obliged the right by abandoning all certainty and embracing the relativism that the right had just shed. The principle that we all have the right to be free from the extractive power of others transmutated into the principle that no one perspective is worth more than any other. Underlying this transformation of the left was, of course, the West's deindustrialization, which fragmented the laboring class, a process that technofeudalism continues to do to this day. When the working class was still relatively homogeneous, a relatively solid class consciousness allowed it to put at least a degree of pressure on social democratic governments. Today, class struggle has been replaced by a so-called identity politics. Tragically, the drive to protect racial, sexual, ethnic, and religious minorities and for reparative justice suits just fine people in power who like to appear socially liberal. They enthusiastically embed those causes in their language, as long as they only pay lip service to them and do little of substance to protect minorities from the systemic causes of their oppression. Moreover, this discursive espousal of identity politics allows people in authority to do nothing about the economic and political extractive power that is increasingly intertwined with cloud capital. As for the alt-right, nothing could have pleased them more. They recognize in identity politics a golden opportunity to capitalize on the in-group, defensive, tribal, and racist feelings it arouses in white voters. On this new political stage, social democracy is impossible. We no longer have capital on the one side and labor on the other, allowing a social democratic government to play referee and force the two sides into a compromise. Instead, we have a center and alt-right both in thrall to a new ruling class, the cloudalists, whose rise to power they have enabled, while the left is preoccupied with a civil war on the definition of woman, on the hierarchy of oppressions, and all the rest. Meanwhile, no one speaks for the cloud proles, the cloud serfs, the vassal capitalists, what is left of the traditional proletariat precariat, the victims of climate change, the masses that technofeudalism stifles and imprisons in its cloud fiefs. To revive the original idea of social democracy and indeed of the liberal individual, two things are essential. First, we must discard the myth that the old left-right distinction is obsolete. As long as we live in an empire of capital that rules over and ruthlessly exploits humans and the planet, there can be no democratic politics that is not rooted in a leftist agenda of overthrowing it. Second, we must fundamentally reconfigure what that means and how it can be achieved in the world of technofeudalism, where the empire is built on cloud capital, with all of the new fiendishly complex class structures and conflicts that it engenders. If this sounds hard and complicated, let me offer a simpler formulation. After the war, Marxism confidently offered a threatening truth. The angst-ridden right went relativist, and social democracy got its chance. Following Marxism's great defeat in 1991, Marxist truth perished, liberal truth made a comeback, and social democracy died. After capitalism's 2008 Waterloo and the rise of technofeudalism, liberals, the social democrats, and the alt-right are fighting over whatever scraps of power the cloudless will let them have. Today, our future depends on recovering the confidence to unveil a truth consistent with our techno-feudal condition. It will not be sufficient, but it is necessary. Thomas More wrote in his eponymous Utopia in the 16th century as a thought experiment on how to cure the evils of the feudal order, in which, it must be said, he played a prominent part. Half a century later, Tommaso Campanella published his own Utopia, The City of the Sun, as a polemic against the prominent Aristotelian view that anyone doing manual labor should be denied full citizenship. He counter-argued that it was the artisans and the builders, not the parasitic feudal classes, who ought to have political power. Today's evangelical advocates of crypto technologies, with their faith that Wall Street, cloudless governments, the deep state, the entire techno-feudal order can be brought down by smart computer code and unhackable proof-of-work algorithms, are today's economic utopians, and crypto is as much a reaction to techno-feudalism as the original utopia was a reaction to feudalism. Truth be told, when I first encountered the original paper heralding crypto's arrival, a 2008 blog post signed by the now infamous and elusive Satoshi Nakamoto, I was mesmerized. It began with the sentence, "Commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments." It then proceeded to present an algorithm that would allow us to transact with one another online, bypassing every financial institution ever created. It was not hard to see the enormity of the claims and the potential emancipation it offered from the parasites of the financial sector, private and state-owned. To appreciate crypto's attraction, consider what happens when you use your debit card to buy a train ticket from London to Brighton using a service like trainline.com that charges a small cloud rent, say 75p. Where does it go? From the Trainline app, your 70p is uploaded to another company, Trainline Hauling Limited, which owns the Trainline app, but this company is owned by another, which is owned by another, and another, and another. As your 75p shifts from one shell company to another, it travels from London to Jersey to Luxembourg. It is validated by a number of central banks until it reaches some balmy tax haven. Eventually it joins a global torrent of dollarized financial capital that no government, no parliament, no demos, no human mind can track, let alone regulate. Now compare this to a crypto transaction of the kind Nakamoto's paper herald. You sit in front of your computer. You needed no bank account, no plastic card, no social security number to identify yourself with, not even an email account. You just need a private key in the form of a sequence of seemingly random characters that you generated earlier through a few simple automated cryptographic steps. This private key is all you need to make a payment, send money to a good cause, even vote on an online survey or referendum. In essence, your private key is an address. a bank account, and a social security number all rolled up in a one string of characters that lives only on your computer and is known exclusively to you. However, the moment you use it to transact, it is transmitted to a global network of computers belonging to people like yourself. For a transaction to work, it needs to be verified and recorded, in the same way your bank verifies that you have the cash and that once you have spent it, you cannot spend it again. The difference is that instead of entrusting the verification of your transaction to a bank or some other parasitic capitalist institution, the verification is performed automatically by computers, like yours, comprise that common network. These machines work together to verify your transaction. They do this by competing with each other to solve arbitrary mathematical puzzles, whose purpose is to offer incentives to owners of the fastest computers to help verify your transaction. The machine that wins this contest wins the privilege of adding or recording your transaction as a block on a long record known as a blockchain of every transaction made within this network. In return for that privilege, the winning machine and its owner is rewarded with a proof of work token, a small payment that can be used on the network for future transactions. You can see the lure of crypto. In contrast to the madness that begins the moment you pay for anything using a bank-issued card, the blockchain-based transaction seems like democracy in action. No one takes a cut. No bank or corporation is involved. No state monitors your transaction. No cloudless retains a record of what you bought, when and from whom. No crazy path is taken by dozens of intermediaries contributing at each stage of the accumulation of capital among financiers. Moreover, no one owns the network of machines that help complete your transaction, and, therefore, no investors are watching, checking that the pie is growing and their cut of the cloud rent along with it, ready to pull their support at the moment confidence in the enterprise begins to wane. Not least because this cloud-based network generates no cloud rent. Crypto's birth in 2008 could not have been timed better. In the year that capitalist finance almost died of its own hubris, Bitcoin inspired a wide spectrum of people seeking alternatives. Sworn libertarians, the anarchists and socialists who made up the Occupy Wall Street movement, the so-called cypherpunks, a medley of cryptographers and coders who had been worrying about privacy since the 1980s. But soon cracks began to appear, and it was the libertarian faction of the crypto movement who ultimately gained the upper hand. For them, enemy number one had always been the central banks, which they portrayed as a sort of Catholic church, insisting on acting as intermediary between humans and their sacred prophets, with themselves in the role of a later-day Martin Luther, pushing for a Protestant Reformation. Thus, the crypto movement, which had also initially attracted anarchists and socialists, became a supremely volatile currency market in which anyone sufficiently expert in the new blockchain technology issue their own coins, whose dollar value they tried to boost before cashing in. Their ideological contempt for fiat or state-created money turned out to be a ruse for issuing their own fiat money. By the time in 2017, one Bitcoin traded for more than $20,000. The early emancipatory promise of crypto had vanished. Using similar blockchain methods, model Kate Moss sold a digital photo of herself in the form of a Bitcoin-like string of characters for more than $17,000. Jack Dorsey, then Twitter chief, raised the stakes by selling code linked to an image of the first ever tweet for $2.9 million. To top the madness, Mike Winkleman, an artist known as Beeple, managed to sell at a charity's auction in New York a string of characters linked to a photographic collage of his earlier works for a stunning $69.3 million. Mocking them all, a Brooklyn firm director received $85 for a string of characters attached to an audio file of him flatulating, hopefully in the face of this crypto folly. It could not have been otherwise. Betrayal of its early emancipatory promise was hardwired into the nature of cryptocurrencies. Nakamoto's ambition had been that Bitcoin should take off as a parallel currency. To succeed, people will need to want to use Bitcoin to buy train tickets, drinks, and even houses. But to engineer the scarcity that he believed was necessary to give Bitcoin value, Nakamoto built into the Bitcoin code a fixed upper limit in the total number of Bitcoins, 21 million to be precise. Its limited supply meant that as soon as the demand for Bitcoin rose, so would its exchange rate with dollars. At some point, when the dollar value of Bitcoin rises above some threshold, it makes sense to keep your Bitcoin and use dollars to buy train tickets, drinks, and houses, as well as more Bitcoins in the hope that its value will rise further. It was inevitable that the moment a cryptocurrency began to succeed as a currency, it would stop working like a currency and would turn instead into a pyramid scheme, with its early adopters growing richer as more and more people bought into it. Besides this crypto aristocracy, the only true beneficiary of crypto technologies have been the very institutions that crypto evangelists supposedly aim to overthrow: Wall Street and the big tech conglomerates. For example, JP Morgan and Microsoft recently joined forces to run a consortium blockchain based on Microsoft data centers to improve their joint power to dominate financial services. Similar blockchain projects have been announced by Goldman Sachs and the Hong Kong Central Bank, by the World Bank, indeed by MasterCard and Visa themselves. Rather than itching towards utopia, crypto has become another tool of cloud finance, an engine for the accumulation of cloud capital. Blockchain is, no doubt, a fascinating tool. When I first encountered it, I wrote that it was a brilliant answer to a question we have not discovered yet. But if the question is how to fix capitalism or dethrone technofeudalism, this is not it. Both are encompassing and exploitative systems that by nature have the power to co-opt technical innovation to their own ends. Under capitalism, crypto serves financial capital. Under technofeudalism, it aids and abets the logic of cloud capital accumulation. This does not mean that crypto tech will not at some point prove useful to progressives. If and when we manage to socialize cloud capital and democratize our economies, blockchain technologies will come in handy. But before any of this becomes remotely possible, we need to answer the most pressing of questions. What is the alternative to technofeudalism? And if social democracy is impossible and crypto a false promise, how will we build it? One reason that we, the left, are wallowing in perpetual defeat is our failure to answer the killer question once put to me in a pub by a self-described Cockney Tory who had heard that a socialist was in the house. If you don't like what we have, what would you replace it with? How would it work? I'm all ears. Convince me. I didn't even try, not just because of the din in the crowded pub, which meant I couldn't barely hear myself think, but primarily because I lacked a convincing answer. My consolation was that I was in excellent company. Karl Marx, not exactly a man lacking of self-confidence or imagination, refused to go beyond vague references to the socialism or communism which he predicted and wanted to replace the empire of capital. Why? Marx's own excuse for offering no socialist blueprint was smart. It is beyond the capacities of middle-class intellectual working in the British Liberty reading room or chatting in their posh living rooms. Rather, it is the proletariat who, in pursuing their collective interests, should and will create socialism as they go along, or so Marx said. Today, we know from both the Soviet and the Western European experience with social democracy that this was wishful thinking. A bottom-up socialist blueprint was simply not transpired anywhere. But what was my excuse? Trying to conjure up the blueprint for a realistic utopia is damned hard, not to mention risky. Nevertheless, without a convincing answer to that killer question, the prospect of recruiting people to the cause of reclaiming our minds, bodies, and environment will remain hopeless. A few weeks after that pub encounter, I came across a review of a book I had written, the one I addressed to your granddaughter, about how capitalism works. It was by a political opponent, Ireland's finance minister at the time. He surprised me with some kind words for the book, but predictably was scathing towards my call for systemic change. An exhortation for the creation of an authentic democracy and the collective ownership of technology and the means of production, he wrote, sits very poorly alongside his appreciation of entrepreneurship and individual initiative. Oops, I thought, the man is right. The time had come to stop hiding behind my little finger and to flesh out a blueprint for a convincing alternative system, one that combines collective ownership of the means of production, personal freedom, room for innovative thinking and technological progress, and yes, authentic democracy. The task was clear and daunting. I had to explain how production, distribution, innovation, land use, housing, money, prices, and a host of other stuff would work in a society that has socialized land and capital, including its algorithmic, AI-powered, cloud-based variety. I would have to explain how international trade and money flows would work, what democracy would mean, and how it would function. Between you and me, nothing short of panic describes my state of mind as I sat down to write a book that seemed like a duty bordering on purgatory. It took me a day or two to hit the wall. Every idea I had for how companies would run or how money would be used immediately crashed on the shoulders of my own objections. Progress was impossible. Then I had an epiphany. What does an author do if he disagrees with everything he writes? My answer was to write a novel populated with the characters that each presented one of the various perspectives that were jostling for influence in my mind. Eventually, I managed to boil it down to 3 characters. Ava, a former Wall Street banker, would keep a check on my blueprint from a liberal, technocratic standpoint, one that the aforementioned Irish finance minister ought to appreciate. Iris, a retired anthropologist, would bring to the novel the Marxist feminist perspective that you would love. And Costa, a brilliant technologist, disillusioned by his experience working with big tech, would shed light on the role of cloud capital. But one more issue still needed resolving. The guy at the pub wanted to know how his life would differ under my system in the here and now, with the technologies currently at hand, with our existing human stock, warts and all. I was not allowed, in other words, to project into a technologically more advanced future, nor to populate my alternative system with people better, smarter, or nicer than the ones we meet down the pub or in front of our bathroom mirrors. In short, my blueprint had to be written as if it had been implemented already. However, since history matters and everything we do is path-dependent, it would be daft to describe my system as if it existed in 2020, the year the book would be published, without explaining how it had come about. In other words, I needed a believable alternative history of a political and social revolution that had occurred at some point in the past. To this end, I chose the year 2008 as the point when this alternative history diverged from our own. In my story, I imagine what might have happened if the protests and rebellions that had sprung up in the wake of the crash, gatherings like Occupy Wall Street, Spain's Indignados, and the protests in Athens at Syntagma Square had actually succeeded. And yet it seemed important to me that my 3 characters somehow kept one foot in the reader's side of history, our messed up techno-feudal reality, from which to assess and critique the alternative system I was conjuring up. How could this possibly work? Minds uninfected by science fiction might find this preposterous, but having misspent, as you well know, part of my youth immersed in science fiction where parallel universes and wormholes were commonplace, the die was cast. I would imagine 2 parallel realities, one our own, which the reader, myself, Ava, Iris, and Costa live, and another in which alternative versions of ourselves inhabit a world where technofeudalism has been replaced by a technologically based socialism. In the book, it is referred to as anarcho-syndicalism, but a simpler term would simply be techno-democracy. The drama would be precipitated when an invention of Costa's would open up a portal for written exchange between the two, allowing the characters to offer one another descriptions of their alternative worlds. My answer to the guy in the pub, to the Irish finance minister, to anyone who wants to know what the alternative to technofeudalism is that I am proposing, can be found in the pages of the book that resulted, Another Now, Dispatches from an Alternative Present. What follows is the gist of it, without the various perspectives, objections, and debates of my three characters, but packaged simply in brief glimpses of my alternative to technofeudalism. Ready to imagine another now? Imagine a corporation in which every employee has a single share that they receive when hired, the way a student collects a library card upon enrolling at university. This share, which cannot be sold or leased, grants each employee a single vote. All decisions, hiring, promotion, research, product development, pricing strategy, are taken collectively, with each employee exercising their vote via the company's internet, which thus functions as a permanent shareholders' assembly. Equal ownership does not, however, mean equal pay. Pay is determined by a democratic process that divides the company's post-tax revenues into four slices. One to cover the firm's fixed costs, such as equipment, licenses, utility bills, rent, and interest payments. Another set aside for R&D, a slice from which basic pay to staff is made, and lastly, a slice for bonuses. Again, the distribution between these four slices is decided collectively on a one-person, one-vote basis. Any proposal to increase one slice must be accompanied by a proposal to reduce expenditure on one or more of the other slices. Competing proposals are put to a vote where employee shareholders rank each proposal in order of preference via an electronic ballot form. If no plan wins an absolute majority of first preferences, a process of elimination takes place. The plan with the fewest first preferences is knocked out, and its first preference votes are reallocated to the voter's second preference. This simple algorithmic process is repeated until one business plan has acquired more than half the votes cast. Having determined the amount of money the company will spend on the various slices, the basic pay slice is then divided equally among all staff, from persons recently employed as secretaries or cleaners to the firm's star designers or engineers. Which leaves one important question unanswered. How do they decide the distribution of the bonus slice between staff? The answer is via a variant of the voting scheme made famous by the Eurovision Song Contest, in which each participating country is given a set number of points that it can allocate to the songs of every other country. In this spirit, once a year, employees are each given 100 digital tokens to distribute among their colleagues. The idea is simple. You allot these tokens to those colleagues whom you believe to have contributed most during the previous year. Once the tokens have been distributed, the total bonus slice is allocated in proportion to the number of tokens each employee has received from their colleagues. The impact of legislating such a corporate governance system would be the equivalent of a large comet crashing into technofeudalism's bedrock. On the most superficial level, it would liberate employees from the tyranny of self-serving managers, but on a spectral level, it would do so much more. First, it would eliminate the distinction between wages and profits. Thus, we have collective ownership, and we have eliminated the fundamental class divide between those who own and collect profits or rents and those who lease their time for a wage. We have also abolished the market for shares. Only an employee can own a share in a company, and only one share that cannot be sold or leased. thus cutting the umbilical cord that links finance and share markets speculation. In a stroke, we have ended financialization and destroyed private equity. We have also, most probably, done away with the need for regulators whose job is to break up large corporations before they establish monopolies. As collective decision making becomes unwieldy in companies beyond a certain size, say 500 people, it seems wholly likely that the employee shareholders would not form them, and in the case of already formed conglomerates, would vote to break them up in smaller companies. Most people I know, including generations of students I have taught, assume that capitalism equals markets, that socialism must mean the end of prices as signals to producers and customers. Nothing could be further from the truth. Capitalist firms are market-free zones within which a non-market process extracts surplus value from employees, which then take the form of rent, profit, and interest. The larger the firm and the more cloud capital it employs, the greater the rents it extracts from a society whose markets malfunction as a result. In contrast, the democratized companies I propose here and in another now are more consistent with well-functioning competitive markets in which prices, free from the scourge of rent and concentrated market power, are formed. Put differently, doing away with capitalist firms through terminating labor and share markets paves the ground for truly competitive product markets and a process of price formation that powers up the great engine of entrepreneurship and innovation which conventional thinking wrongly associates with capitalism. What would all this mean for the cloudless? The previous Bezoses, Mark Zuckerbergs, and Musks would wake up to find they owned a single share in their company, granting them a single vote on every single item of the continuous time agenda of the Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, or Tesla decision-making process. They would have to sway a majority of their fellow, equally empowered employee shareholders. Control over the firm's cloud capital, including the almighty algorithms at their center, would be democratized, at least within the bounds of the company. Even so, cloud capital's potency would be no less great. Its nature as a produced means of behavioral modification would remain unchanged, and so the good society would need additional protections from it. One such protection would be a Social Accountability Act, stipulating that every corporation be granted according to an index of social worthiness to be compiled by panels of randomly selected citizens, the equivalent of juries, chosen from a diverse pool of stakeholders, the company's customers, members of the communities it affects, and so on. If a company's rating falls consistently below a certain threshold, a public inquiry may result in the company's deregistration. A second, even more permanent social protection is afforded by the termination of free services. We have learned the hard way what happens when services are funded by selling users' attention to third parties. It turns the users into cloud serfs, whose labor enhances and reproduces cloud capital, further tightening its grip on our minds and behavior. To replace the illusion of free services, our alternative reality features a micropayment platform. Let's call it Penny for Your Thought. This works a bit like Netflix's subscription model, but combined with the British National Health Service principle of universal provision. App developers needing our data have to pay to get it from consenting users, who are protected by a bill of digital rights that guarantee us all the rights to choose which of our data to sell and to whom. The combination of the micropayment platform and the bill of digital rights terminates, in practice, the current attention-grabbing market model. At the same time, anyone using an app pays the developer for access to it. The sums involved are small for the individual, but for an app with a large pool of users, they add up. Would that not prevent some people from being able to afford digital services they need? No, because the way money works in this alternative system. Imagine that the central bank provided everyone with a free digital wallet, effectively a free bank account. To attract people to use it, a stipend or basic dividend is credited monthly to each bank, making universal basic income a reality. Taking one step further, the central bank pays interest to those who shift monies from their savings to commercial banks to their new digital wallets. In time, a mass, if not total exodus would follow as people move their savings from the private banks to this new public digital payments and savings system. Would this not require the central bank to mint vast amounts of money? Yes, the stipends will have to be minted anew, though not at a rate that exceeds the quantity central banks have been minting since 2008 to bolster permanently unstable private banks. As for the rest of the money, it has already been minted by the private banks. All that happens here is that it migrates from the private bank's unsafe ledger to the safe ledger of the central bank. As people and companies begin to pay one another using the system, all money stays on the central bank ledger, moving from one part of it to another with every transaction, rather than being available to bankers and their shareholders to gamble with it. This turns central banks from pliant servants of private bankers to something like a monetary commons. To oversee its operations, including the quantity of money in the system and the privacy of each person's transaction, the central bank is answerable to and monitored by a monetary supervision jury comprising randomly selected citizens and experts drawn from a wide range of professions. What about investment? In this system, you can lead your savings to a startup or to a mature firm, but you can't buy a chunk of any firm, since shares are distributed solely on the one employee, one share basis. Rather, you can lend your savings directly either using a central bank digital wallet or via an intermediary, but with this crucial stipulation: that intermediary cannot create money out of thin air, as banks do today whenever they issue a loan, but must trade in already existing funds from really existing savers. What about taxation? Recall that there are three types of income. First, the basic dividends, credited to citizens' digital wallets by the central bank. Second, earnings from working in the democratized companies, comprising basic salary plus bonuses. Third, interest paid to savers by the central bank or by private intermediaries. None of these incomes are taxed, nor are they any sales tax, VAT, or anything of the sort. So who finances the state? Every company does via fixed tax on all revenues, for example, 5%. Note that this is a fixed proportion of total revenues, not profits, preventing the infinite scope for accounting tricks that dress up expenses as costs in order to shrink companies' taxable income. The only other taxes fall on commercial land and buildings, discussed further below. When it comes to international trade and payments, a new international financial system guarantees continual wealth transfer to the global south, while also restraining trade and financial balances of the type that inflate bubbles and cause financial crashes. The idea is that all trade and all money movements between different monetary jurisdictions, such as the UK, Germany, China, and the United States, are denominated in a new digital international accounting unit, which I call the cosmos. If the cosmos value of a country's imports exceeds its exports, the country is charged an imbalance levy in proportion to its trade deficit. Equally, if a country's exports exceeds its imports, it is also charged the same levy in proportion to its trade surplus. This terminates the mercantilist motive for one country persistently to extract value from another country by selling to it goods of greater value than those it imports from it, and, subsequently, lending them the money to continue buying from it, a form of vendor finance that places the weaker country in permanent debt bondage. Meanwhile, a second surge levy is charged to a country's Cosmos account whenever too much money moves too quickly out of it or into the country. For decades, developing countries were undermined whenever the smart money detecting future economic growth, for example, South Korea, Thailand, or some African countries, rushed in to buy land and companies before their price went up. As the money inflow surged, the prices of land and companies skyrocketed, and false expectations regarding the level of growth set in, thus inflating bubbles. The moment the bubbles burst, as they inevitably do, the smart money rushed out of the country faster than it had rushed in, leaving nothing but ruined lives and economies behind. The purpose, therefore, of the surge levy is to tax these speculative money movements to stop unnecessary damage to the weakest of countries. Proceeds from these two levies are then used to fund direct green investment in the global south. The one employee, one share, one vote system has revolutionary effects. It brings to an end share and labor markets and the empire of capital. It democratizes workplaces and it organically diminishes the size of conglomerates. The reconfiguration of the central bank's ledger as a common payment and saving system has similarly revolutionary effects. Without actually banning private banks, it pulls the rug from under their feet by liberating us all from our dependence on them to make payments or to store our savings. Moreover, the basic dividend provision revolutionizes our way of thinking about work, time, and value, liberating us from the oppressive moral equation of paid drudgery and virtue. Finally, the cosmos system balances the international ebb and flow of goods and money, preventing the exploitation of weaker economies by the more powerful ones while funding green investments in the parts of the world they are most needed. These are the fundamental building blocks of an economy liberated from the tyranny of capital and thus denying technofeudalism the foothold it needs to take us over. The question now arises, how exactly do we free our societies from the tyranny of rent, the ancient ground rent variety which survived capitalism's defeat of feudalism, and the cloud rents on which technofeudalism relies? The coffee is almost ready. Your laptop is booting up. Before long, coffee mug in hand, you are pursuing the morning's newsfeed from a media site run from your neighborhood library. The first item on the news concerns an upcoming local referendum. The second is beamed in from Brazil on the struggle to compensate its indigenous peoples for decades of illegal logging. The third relates a debate within the current membership of the Monetary Supervision Jury on whether the central bank should lower the interest rates savers receive or alternatively increase everyone's basic dividend. It is a little dry for your taste, so carefully to avoid the sports pages, you'll click on your favorite section devoted to archaeology, which is constantly updated by researchers from all over the world. Ah yes, now this gets your pulse racing. Your newsfeed and its accompanying sections are compiled by an algorithm calibrated and maintained by the local public media center, which is in turn owned by your municipality, but controlled by local people selected through a combination of lotteries and elections. Sometimes you get bored with their newsfeed and turn to a digital world map full of dots, each one representing another local public media centers whose newsfeed you can access at a click. Every time you visit a media center outside your area, a tiny payment leaves your central bank account and helps fund the good people who offer you a window to their world. No ads, no behavioral modification algorithms. As for these tiny payments, they are insignificant in comparison to the basic dividend paid to you by the central bank monthly. Besides, paying them makes you feel good. They buy you and everyone else civilization. They offer you a bay window onto the world, to cooperative media centers strewn all over the planet, trying their hardest to provide good, diverse, exciting information, knowledge, and a touch of wisdom as your local media outlet advertises its wares. Your coffee mug empty, it is time to go to work. You tap on your phone's travel app, also provided by your municipality, and then tap again on work. A list appears of fares offered by various driver cooperatives. alongside information on where and when you can catch the nearest bus or train. You recall with a brief shudder the days of Uber and Lyft, those cloud thieves that exploited drivers' labor, turning them into cloud pros, and passengers' data turning you into a cloud serf. The bad memory dissipates when you remind yourself that these days, the driver owners and the public transport staff control the algorithms, not the other way around. And you set off with a spring in your step now that you are no longer employed by a capitalist firm owned by opaque shell companies that treated you like a cross between a robot and human folder. Life is still a minefield of worries, especially as we may have wrecked the climate irreparably, but at least work is not systematically soul destroying. At work, we have an app on your phone that gives you access to all sorts of shareholder employee ballots, some of which you vote in and some of which you choose to skip. If you have an idea for a new way of doing things or a new product, you post it on the company's idea board and wait to see who among your colleagues wants to work with you to develop it. If no one does, you can still go ahead and repost the idea once it is better developed. Things are not perfect. Human nature always finds a ways of messing up even the best of systems. Your colleagues, if they summon a majority, can vote to have you fired. But the atmosphere at work is now one of shared responsibility, which reduces stress and creates an environment in which mutual respect has a better chance to flourish. On your way home, as your cab exits the commercial zone, you cast your mind back to the sand ages, when to have somewhere to live, people had to choose between mortgage debt, bondage, and renting, between life in thrall to either the banker or the landlord, between predatory mortgage rates and rapacious rents. Now, every region is run by a county association that oversees the division of land between commercial and social zones, so that rents collected from the former fund the provision of social housing in the latter. As is the norm, the people who officiate at the county association are selected randomly, with the help of an algorithm that guarantees fair representation of the various groups and communities within the county. Home is no longer a constant source of anxiety, but somewhere you feel able to put down roots for the long term. I'll leave you to imagine the rest of your life in this alternative present, while I explain a bit more about this most crucial aspect of it, the ownership of land and property, that oldest of foundations of both the feudal and capitalist systems, and the sharing of power. The key to the rent charging system in the commercial zone is a permanent auction subletting scheme, PASS, a mechanism designed to ensure that communities can extract maximum rents from their commercial zones with which to invest in their social zones. PASS works a little like the famous trick for fairly distributing a cake between two people. One person's cut, the other chooses. In the same spirit, PASS creates a permanent auction that pits current occupiers of a commercial space against prospective occupiers. Once a year, as a current occupier in the commercial zone, you must visit PASS and submit your evaluation of your property based on two rules. First, PASS will compute your monthly rent as a fixed portion of your self-declared market value, with no audit, no red tape, no haggling, no estate agent. Great, right? But here comes the second rule. Anyone can, at any point in the future, visit PASS and offer a higher valuation, in which case you are out and they are in within 6 months. This second rule guarantees that you have an incentive to declare your evaluation as truthfully and accurately as you can. If you overstate your true valuation, you will end up paying your rent higher than it's worth. And if you overestimate it, you increase the chances of regretting your evaluation. The moment someone offers a higher value, one closer to its true valuation, and in doing so boosts you out. The beauty of PASS is that county association does not have to set rents in the commercial zone. In the first instance, their job is simply to decide which land and buildings to assign to the commercial zones and which to the social zones. If they set aside too much land for the social zones, they will have less money to invest in them. Conversely, expanding the commercial zones leaves less room for social housing and social enterprises. Once the county association has decided how to resolve the trade off, their second, harder task awaits: defining the criteria according to which social housing, especially the more desirable homes, are distributed. This is the toughest nut to crack. So, who sits on the county association is crucial. An elected county association will replace the tyranny of land ownership with the tyranny of electoral systems, which have an inherent propensity to beget powerful hierarchies. Knowing this, ancient Athenians democrats opposed elections and replaced them with lotteries, the idea in which the Western jury system has its roots. If anything can recreate a land commons in a technologically advanced society, your county association comprised of randomly selected locals is surely it. The same principle extends beyond the regions and the counties to the governance of your nation as a whole, which takes place with the help of a nationwide citizens' assembly, comprising randomly selected citizens from all over the land. This functions as a test bed of ideas, policies, and legislation. Deliberation by its juror members helps shape the bills that Parliament later debates and passes. The demos, at long last, has been put back into democracy. Over the course of this book, I have outlined the system that I have come to believe is replacing, and in many contexts has already replaced, capitalism, the system I call technofeudalism. Whenever I have presented this argument in the past, it has invariably been met with consternation and even anger among those on the left. Understandably so. Anyone who finds solace, as you did that, in the faith that capitalism is bound to be replaced by socialism, as Marx predicted it would be, is bound to feel disheartened and dismayed that post-capitalism has arrived but socialism has not. Indeed, that the system that has replaced it is even worse. But there is another, more troubling reason for their reaction. A Marxist activist once put it to me splendidly: Yanis, if you are right that exploitation takes place beyond the confines of the capitalist firm, he said, with disarming honesty, then organizing the proletariat is never going to be enough. This is precisely my point. I am not suggesting that organizing factory workers, train drivers, teachers, and nurses is no longer necessary. What I'm saying is that it is far from sufficient. In a world increasingly dominated by cloud capital, which is produced largely by the free labor of unwaged cloud serfs, organizing the proletariat, and indeed the precariat, is not going to cut it. To stand any chance of overthrowing techno-feudalism and putting the demos back into democracy, we need to gather together not just the traditional proletariat and the cloud proles, but also the cloud serfs and indeed at least some of the vassal capitalists. Nothing less than such a grand coalition that includes them all can undermine techno-feudalism sufficiently. It may sound like a tall order, and it is, but a resistance to capital's exorbitant power was always a tall order. When I think of what it took to organize a trade union in the 19th century, I shudder. Workers, miners, dockers, shearers, seamsters face beatings by mounted police and violence from thugs in the capitalist employ. Above all, they face losing their jobs at a time when foregoing a day's wage meant hunger for their families. Even when they managed to stage a successful strike, whatever wage rise they secured was shared by the non-strikers, adding to a calculus that already weighed heavily against mobilization. And yet, they mobilized. They did so against the odds, expecting certain massive personal losses in exchange for small and uncertain shared benefits. Techno-feudalism erects a great new barrier to mobilization against it, but it also bestows a great new power upon those who dare dream of a coalition to topple it. The great new barrier is a physical isolation of cloud serfs and cloud proles from one another. We interact with and are subject to cloud capital via our individual screens, via our personal mobile phones, via the digital services that monitor and manage Amazon warehouse workers. Collective action is made harder when people have fewer opportunities to come together. But herein lies the great power that cloud capital presents to its potential rebels: a capacity to build coalitions, organize, and take action via the cloud. In its early days, this was one of the promises of Twitter, of course, that it could enable the mobilization of the masses. From the Arab Springs to Black Lives Matter, we have seen how far the promise has been realized and how far it has not. But I am not talking just about a mobilization via the cloud, but about actions that could actually take place using the systems and technologies of the cloud. In another now, I imagine global action targeting one cloudless company at a time, starting with Amazon. Imagine an international coalition of trades unions calling upon Amazon warehouse workers worldwide to stay away for one day. On its own, such action is feasible. But not so if a broader campaign persuaded enough of its users and customers globally not to visit the Amazon website just for that one day, to resist their status as serfs or vassals for that brief window. The personal inconvenience involved would be trivial, but its cumulative effect remarkable. Even if it were only mildly successful, causing per se a 10% drop in Amazon's usual revenues, while Amazon's warehouse strike disrupted deliveries for 20 hours, such action might prove enough to push Amazon's share price down in ways that no traditional labor action could achieve. This is how cloud pros and cloud serfs can unite effectively. It's what I call cloud mobilization. The beauty of a cloud mobilization is that it stands on its head the conventional calculus of collective action. Instead of maximal personal sacrifice for minimal collective gain, we have the opposite: minimal personal sacrifice delivering large collective and personal gains. This reversal has the potential to pave the way towards a coalition of cloud serfs and cloud pros that is large enough to disrupt cloudless control over billions of people. Naturally, actions of this sort against one or even several major cloudless enterprises won't be enough. The cloud rebellion I envision will need to recruit to its cause many diverse constituencies, including, for example, anyone who loses sleep when their water and energy bills arrive. Smartly calculated, targeted payment strikes could be used to cause an equivalent drop in the private utility company's share and derivative prices. Timed well, these peaceful guerrilla strikes could do a lot of damage to the political and economic cloud of conglomerates whose fates are increasingly fused with that of cloud finance. The rebellion could gather international support as well if it used, say, a consumer boycott in the United States specifically to target a company for its squeezing of workers in Nigeria or the destruction of natural reserves in the Congo. Another campaign could involve inviting nominations from all over the world for companies with the worst record of zero-hour contracts or low pay, big carbon footprints, or poor working conditions, or those that are in the habit of downsizing to boost share prices and then organizing a mass withhold of pension contributions to the pension funds that own shares in those companies. Merely announcing the targeting of pension funds would be enough to send its shares crashing and to cause an exodus of worrying investors from equity funds related to it. Inspired by WikiLeaks, I imagine now a group of rebels writing and uploading digital viruses whose purpose would simply be transparency, to trace and reveal to the world the hidden digital connections between cloudless, government agencies, and the bad actors like the fossil fuel companies. How and whether this is possible, I do not know, but I am convinced that if by whatever means these institutions knew that they had billions of eyes strained on their actions, they would be paralyzed. And as the scales fell from those billions of eyes, the coalitions would summon further allies and support. None of this is either easy or inevitable, but it is harder or less likely than what the miners, the seamstresses, and the dock workers envisioned and sacrificed their lives to achieve in the 19th century. The cloud takes, but the cloud also gives to those who want to reclaim freedom and democracy. It is up to them, to us, to decide and to prove which is greater. Your younger self was onto something. Private capital, you surmised, back in the 1940s can only be owned by the very few. As long as it is privately owned, it's in its nature to concentrate. But concentrated capital means concentrated power, which means that unless society takes capital over, it's all futile. Freedom, autonomy, social democracy, liberal democracy, every single one an empty word in the business of embellishing and predefining an inevitable tyranny of capital. When in 1981 the socialists won the Greek general election by a landslide, you were glad we no longer had to fear the secret police. Nevertheless, as everyone around you was getting drunk on the spirit of the moment, you remained defiantly pessimistic. Without democratizing work, you insisted social democracy is impossible, no matter how well-meaning or smart the social democrats in government. History came down on your side, but not in the way that pleased you. Our greatest defeat was, of course, not the failure of social democracy in Greece or anything else. It was the failure of the Soviet experiment, the only large-scale attempt to take capital under society's control. It produced significant innovations in both science and technology, but the Soviet central planning system failed to press those into society's service. Soviet scientists invented cybernetics with the potential, decades before Google or Amazon, to coordinate people's preferences and efforts automatically. Except that the Soviet top-down system could not exploit these for the benefit of society it was meant to serve. And so appalling authoritarianism and daily drudgery led to total defeat in 1991. Subsequently, private capital was free to go on a global rampage that culminated in the crash of 2008 and the rise of the most formidable mutation, a cloud-based capital with a monstrous power to usurp minds and markets. Thanks to the endless funds of central banks with which the cloudless have built their empires, we are all now, like Stelarc's Movatar, wired into the circuits of technofeudalism. So there you have it, Dad. The answer to your question is in. It bears good and bad news. The bad news is that the internet bred a form of capital which killed capitalism but replaced it with something far worse. The good news is that we now have at our disposal tools that neither the Soviets nor the reforming Social Democrats ever had, and with which we might reestablish a new commons. In short, we live under a new form of serfdom, but we hold in our hands a hitherto non-existent golden opportunity to realize your dream of a leisured, freedom-maximizing bottom-up communism. How likely is it that we take advantage of it? I am damned if I know. But then again, could people like us in, say, 1776 realistically have imagined universal suffrage or the abolition of slavery? What I do know is that which you and Hesiod taught me. Our remarkable knack for technological revolution does not let us stay put. It pushes it violently into contradictions, and the choices that go with them. We are fast approaching a fork in the road where our path will lead either to a world resembling Star Trek, where machines help us improve ourselves, or to a dystopia like The Matrix, in which humans are merely the fuel that powers an empire of machines. To most people, I am sure, barbarism, climate Armageddon, The Matrix seems much more likely than any good outcome. Then again, whenever people thought good outcomes were guaranteed, I am thinking of your comrades in the prison camps who believed that a redemptive communism was just around the corner. The result was either a new type of tyranny or defeat. You, on the other hand, bore the hardships of that prison camp despite harboring deep doubts in place of your comrades' certainties. Today we must do the same. As long as there is even the remotest chance of a successful cloud rebellion, then our only chance of achieving a good life of the eudaimonia, or flourishing, which Aristotle believed to be our ultimate aim, is to hope and act without the slightest of guarantees. At the very least, we do not have fewer reasons to persevere than you did in that prison camp hellhole. Marx famously described our condition under capitalism as one of alienation, owing to our having no ownership of the products of our labor, to our having no say in how things get done. Under technofeudalism, we no longer own our minds. Every proletarian is turning into a cloud prole during working hours and into a cloud serf the rest of the time. Every self-employed striver mutates into a cloud vassal, while every self-employed struggler becomes a cloud serf. While privatization and private equity asset strip all physical wealth around us, cloud capital goes about the business of asset stripping our brains. To own our minds individually, we must own cloud capital collectively. It's the only way we can return our cloud-based artifacts from a produced means of behavioral modification to a produced means of human collaboration and emancipation. Cloud serfs, cloud pros, and cloud vassals of the world unite. We have nothing to lose but our mind chains. All right, that was amazing. That last chapter of that book was the best chapter of the book. I'm kind of lost for words. I like that at the end there he was referencing the Communist Manifesto, like basically, creating a new phrase from which people should, band together and fight for a better world, because the Communist Manifesto did that for the proletarians in the struggle against capitalism, and now his book is about the people uniting against technofeudalism, and kind of getting his own phrase or doing his own little take of that famous phrase from the Communist Manifesto is really fun. Other than that, it was an amazing chapter. I really enjoyed his look into cryptocurrency. That was interesting because I had never really understood how cryptocurrency worked until now, or at least understood the idea behind it. And it's very interesting to kind of see how he puts it and explaining how it had the potential to be one of the most revolutionary technologies, but it was basically hijacked by capitalists and techno-feudalists alike. And it was just turned into this awful thing that just helped people get richer and richer instead of actually serving its original purpose. And that's really sad to kind of hear. Then he started talking about his other book, Another Now. It's a book that I also own. I've owned it for as long as I've owned Technofeudalism, and I've been very curious to read it. But now that he explained the kind of the way it worked, or kind of, okay, let's take a step back. The reason why he wrote it in the first place is very interesting. The way that the book and the story itself works with the two parallel universes, and just generally the idea that it puts forth a alternative system that we could live in, an alternative system to techno-feudalism, a completely new thing. I do have to add that he called it, was it techno-democracy? I think that's speaking from a purely writer's point of view, come on, Yanis, you didn't have a better, more creative name. I mean, I get it. After the description that he gave, I get what he means, but come on, man, it's kind of a boring name, but I have my preferences, right? But whatever. The point is that the way that he condensed into 20 pages basically the entire theory behind his Another Now book is one, kind of funny because damn, all right, the other book, Another Now, is almost 300 pages of sci-fi goodness, and the theory is only 20 pages long, and he, to be fair, didn't get super into it, so yeah, I guess it would be longer, but still, it offered a perspective that was so interesting to read. And as a person who myself, likes to do business and likes to think about these things and how I want to organize Politdigm, for example, in the future, I worry a lot about these exact issues of like, how do I, as a person who considers themselves a Marxist, want to organize my company to make sure that I am, following my ideology correctly, and also making sure that I make the best possible, company, the best possible workplace environment, et cetera, et cetera. And this book gave me ideas which I had never thought about. I love the idea of splitting up the money that a company makes into four different sectors, or parts of a pie, and then kind of creating a system where, through democracy and workplace democracy, the employees get to organize the way that, the amounts or the percentages of the money that go to each of those parts, and then specifically the bonus part, which is, it's such an interesting idea of, giving each worker these 100 points, and then they could distribute those 100 points throughout their colleagues, and then at the end of the day they count up, the entire the amount that each person, each worker, the amount of points they have in the company, and then create basically a distribution with that, and give the person with the most amount of points the largest percentage, and then, and just keep going to like that. And that is such an interesting and amazing, honestly, and the most fair way to ensure that bonuses are shared and given exactly how the workplace thinks, they deserve to be. And that creates an amazing just workplace environment and a feeling of community that I had never thought about. Then the sort of new way of working with money, completely changing up the way that we work with money, and changing the way that banks work, creating this new commons of banking commons, which works in a completely new way, and the way of organizing counties, and the way of organizing countries, and the way of having a completely new system, the Cosmos system, to deal with the way that countries interact with each other, specifically those of the global south, always putting the global south in the kind of a seat of importance when it comes to giving them money so that they can develop and basically regain all the years they've lost of development and resources that we as the global north have ripped from their hands. And that is an amazing idea, and an idea which I, again, had never had. So I'm very glad that I read this part of the book. Obviously I was going to read it, but that gave me so many great ideas. And I really have to say that Yanis is really onto something, and that's dope, I guess. I don't know how to word it in another way. Then we come to like the little part where he's basically describing like a day in the life of his dad in the alternative Another Now universe. And that part kind of made me emotional in a way. I think it is because the way that he wrote it feels so real and so tangible, and doesn't feel as much as a sci-fi story as something that could actually be happening, but it isn't. And the fact that it isn't is so depressing, because the reality that he is presenting is so much more attractive than the current one we live in, that it just kind of made me go, damn, our current world is really in a bit of a pickle. And it's not just that, it was also because the way that he's, presenting it as if it is kind of a day in his father's life, a life that his dad never lived, and a life that his dad would have wanted to live but never did. And that also is kind of emotional, because it's like, damn, it gets you emotional, because you can feel kind of what Yanis is trying to do is, touch your emotions with that bit. And then, yeah, at the end, it's what I said. It's, it's a great message, and the idea of, hey, we, as much as it has taken, as technofeudalism has taken a lot from us, it has also given us opportunities and tools that we've never had before. The kind of when he talks about that, before, when fighting for a cause, you had a lot to lose, and in most times you barely gained anything. And currently we have almost nothing to lose and so much to gain. In sacrificing our own sort of life to gain something, the weights of what is being sacrificed and what we gained has changed, and that's very interesting. That does motivate a person to go, hey, okay, it is tangible that we actually do something. We can actually mobilize, unite, and fight for a better future. And that is what he does at the end of the book. Is hey, look, we need to all unite, all the cloud serfs, the cloud pros, the vassals. We need to all come together and stick it up the cloudless behind and fight for a better world. And it's possible to do something. We're not doomed. The world is not doomed. As he said, sure, we'll always have problems with the environment, and probably after the dismantlement of technofeudalism, one of the, after achieving this new system that he calls democracy, one of the biggest focuses, or one of the most important things that we need to focus on, is one of the things that capitalism and now technofeudalism has destroyed the most, and that is the environment. And so that would always be that stress. Are we going to be able to reverse the damages that we've made? I have no clue. I am not well versed in that topic, but it is definitely going to be something that is crucial that we do, because if we don't, then anything that we do with this techno democracy, this form of socialism, is pointless, because if we have no planet, then, well, it was kind of for nothing. So that is something that, of course, we would always have to focus on. But with that being said, wow, this book is amazing. As I said in the beginning of the episode, I think it's been a while since the beginning of the episode for me and for you, because it's been an hour and 30 minutes. This is the last chapter that I'm reading of this book. There still is 2 appendixes. Let me just check to say exactly what's still left. There is 2 appendixes, influences, readings, acknowledgements that Yanis does, some notes, and an index. These are things which I'm not going to read. If you want to read them, I suggest that you buy the book. Go support Yanis. Go support his work. Check out his other books. Check out his work. And overall, he is an amazing writer and a person that I very much look up to. I'd say that in the modern age, he is a Marxist that a lot of us can look up to and should listen to, because he has some amazing ideas. And, I have nothing else to say. He's just an amazing man, and I very much love his work, and I loved reading this book so much. And I'm very excited to read another now, although that is not going to be the next book that we read. And I'm not going to tell what the next book I'm going to read is yet. I'm not going to tell you that. You'll have to find out. But before that, next week, I'll have a little treat for you. So keep your eyes open for that. With that being said, of course, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to support us over on Patreon. If you can support us on Patreon, check out our website. The link is in the description below. So you can find out how you can support us through alternative means. This means helping us out with editing, helping us out with our social media platforms. Go check it out and you'll find out what exactly I mean. Also, make sure to join our Discord server, so that if you also happen to support us on Patreon, you can submit questions to our podcast Q&A, because each week on Wednesdays, we post the Politdigm podcast on YouTube and social media platforms. That's not what I meant. And streaming platforms. And you can submit questions for us to answer at the end of each episode of the Politdigm podcast. And of course, also make sure to check out our social media platforms, so that you can, for example, have the latest news about what we are planning for Politdigm Reads, what next books we're going to read. And if there's some sort of emergency, like it happened a few weeks ago regarding the the Politdigm podcast and our blog, where we simply didn't have the time to post the blog and post the podcast episode. So we told everybody, look, hey, we had an emergency, something went down, we'll see you all next week. And so, sometimes emergencies happen. So make sure to follow us on social media so that you're up to date with the latest Politdigm news. And with that being said, thank you all so much for the support in the series. Thank you so much for watching these episodes of Technofeudalism. I'm very happy that everybody's enjoying this series. And I am honestly kind of sad, but also very happy to say that I finally finished this book. And I'll see you all next week with something a little special. Goodbye, everybody.